Hello, everyone. Here I am with the sequel video that I promised a long time ago on my last Jane Eyre adaptations video. This one is going to be looking at retellings and radio. Like all my videos, this is going to have some spoilers about the plot of both Bronte's original novel and one of the retellings that we're looking at today. So, if you aren't familiar with either, I would say pause the video, read Jane Eyre at least, and then come back and watch this video. Or if you're fine with hearing spoilers, just go ahead and keep watching. The first retelling I want to look at today is called The Memoirs of Jane E. by Erin McCulloch. As you can see, this is a trilogy instead of one long novel, and it basically takes Jane's story and sets it in a sci-fi context. And overall, I would give the series probably a 6 out of 10. So I liked it because it was really fun to experience a classic novel I love in a whole new way, where I know how it's going to turn out at the end, but at the same time, it has surprises as Jane is plucked from Victorian England into futuristic America. But I did have some things that I wasn't super keen on Cup writing into the story that I didn't love it enough to necessarily recommend it. So I'll just quickly walk you through it, compare some of the changes made to Jane's story, and sort of examine it. So the first book, Unclaimed, goes from Jane's childhood up until her first meeting with Mr. Rochester, who is called Thorn in the story. So I like the way Jane and Helen's relationship I felt was given more attention than it was in the original, because Helen is a major reason why Jane doesn't become an embittered older version of the child she starts out as. Having a friend who knows how to follow Christ and love and forgive her enemies is what helps Jane grow up to be the resilient and faithful young woman that everyone knows and loves. And when Jane is 21, she leaves her boarding school to go work as a homeschooler to a little girl named Curdy in the Arizona desert. Curdy doesn't live in the desert, quick clarification, just in this really fancy high-tech mansion there. And one thing that Cup did, which is something she does throughout the series and why I think she did a great job overall with adapting Bronte's novel, is that she knew where parts of Jane's story had to be upgraded or edited to fit the world she's living in, which is now sci-fi and not the 19th century. And the way Thornfield, aka M. Hein Matcha, is presented is that Jane, Curdy, and Curdy's nurse are the only people in the house. All the servants are robots, or in Mrs. Fairfax's case, a hologram. And so it gives you a greater sense of Jane's isolation and restlessness. And it just really speaks to our modern age with AI being on the rise and freaking everybody out. And the fact that, we have a lot of this high flying technology. And so it goes on until finally one night Jane is restless and so she's walking the desert and she sees this giant dog and a burglar she's afraid is going to break into the house. Well, he is breaking into the house. So Jane has to pull him out and make him promise that he will leave the house untouched, but he doesn't. Jane then learns that this burglar is none other than her employer, Podrick Gadra, aka Parker Garfield Thorne. And overall, great book, but one issue I had with it was that they made Aiden, the Helen Burns's figure's backstory, unnecessarily dark and mature. And I didn't think it had to be that way. All right, book two is Nameless. So this goes from Jane and Thorne's first conversation up until their crashed wedding day. And I had to laugh a little when she's first talking to Thorne because he's introduced as wearing a t-shirt and shorts and he uses words like yeah. So that felt like quite the contrast from Edward Rochester, who is the very stiff, formal Victorian gentleman with the waistcoat and the tie 24/7, and who goes on all these rants with all this abstract, flowery language. So, yep. And instead of Grace Poole, who's this servant with a creepy laugh on whom Jane's employer blames everything. It's that the house systems just start going out of control for no reason. Like the shower will start turning on, the lights will flare on in the middle of the night. Or when Jane's trying to put out the fire in Thorne's bedroom, she's trying to get the sprinklers to work and they aren't turning on. And so she has to like literally climb up and like grab them. And no one knows why that's happening. Then, after the fire scene, Jane meets La Blanca, a famous Argentinian model whom you may recognize as the Miss Ingram figure. This was in my second issue with the book, the way Blanca is portrayed. I mean, I get it. If you're trying to be modern, it's like she'd probably be glamorous and way too flashy and showy, but I feel like it was a little overdone, and Blanca was described as being way too scantily dressed for my tastes. And, we have a version of the gypsy scene, which is also pretty funny. Mr. Rule, aka Mason, gets attacked by the house system. Jane goes off to her aunt, forgives her despite her aunt still hating her. And then she comes back, gets engaged to Thorne, and here comes another thing I had problems with. It was that Jane gets so carried away by the thrills and this, like, oh man, I'm engaged to my employer, that she literally spends the night with him in his bed. And she wakes up like, what am I doing? And I'm thinking, you're Jane Eyre. You don't do this. And on their wedding day, um, what's revealed is that Thorne's wife is a woman named Laura, whose father owns this big drug company. And Laura was being used as a human guinea pig by her father to the point where she became a horrible drug addict who would break out violently if anyone seemed to try to take her off her drugs. And her synapses had been tweaked so badly that she can use neural electricity to control the house systems. And that's why the sprinklers will turn off when you most need them. The lights will go on in the middle of the night, the shower will start running, etc., etc. And I really liked that choice for Laura because, it makes Thorne's situation very pitiable. And it was a really creative and creepy way to heighten the drama and, add that gothic element in a way that would still fit the context of the story. Finally, the last book in the series and my personal favorite is Vanished. So this goes from the post-wedding conversation between Jane and Thorne all the way to the very end of the novel. And I really liked the way this played out. It still had the pathos and the heartbreak of the original version of this conversation, which I was really excited when I first read it because the post-wedding conversation is honestly my favorite part of Bronte's original novel, and it's my favorite part of this series. Jane doesn't really seem to be explicitly Christian in this series the way she is in the original. Jane E, I mean, she does talk about the golden rule to Thorne, like, oh, if I were married to someone and I were buried in a living coffin, I would still be that man's wife, even if he didn't love me and all that. And I will not help you cheat on your wife. But I feel that they focused a little too much on the I need to preserve myself aspect of the story. And that's a temptation that a lot of people fall into with the original, especially when they adapted the original for 2011. And I mean, that is part of why Jane leaves for herself. But I feel like you have to be careful when you're taking that tactic because sometimes, at least in my opinion, it can make it sound a little bit like she's being selfish or insensitive to her employer's pain. And I think a big part of why Jane leaves is because she understands that true love means wanting what's best for the other person, helping the other person to grow in sanctity. And so, even in the original, she tells Rochester, I advise you to live sinless and I wish you to die tranquil, excuse me, and reminds him that we will be able to meet again in heaven if we try to live the life God wants us to live. I mean, she does mention that a little bit here to Thorn, like you have yourself and I have myself, and to set his sights higher. So it was great overall. And this and the stakes just increased for this scene because you probably know that with the rise of technology, we've gotten less privacy. And in Jane E's world, there's this thing called a perks ring, which has DNA signature, and it's basically your ID or your social security, and you basically need it to unlock pretty much anything. And Jane realizes, oh no, if I use my perks ring, then Thorne's going to use my signature to find me and try to tempt me again. So even though she knows she'll turn like total vagabond if she leaves it behind, she literally takes off her perks ring, leaves it outside and behind Matcha, and then just strikes out for the unknown. And that just really struck me as wow, what she was willing to endure to do what was right. So Jane wanders for a couple days, is found by the Devine family, aka the Rivers family, in an airport. They fly her to their home in New Hampshire, I want to say, somewhere in New England. She gets a job as a basically as a pre-K monitor to children with disabilities. And my biggest issue with the series was the way they handled the relationship between Jordan, the St. John Rivers figure, and the Rosamund Oliver figure, and the way Jane just seems to deal with it. I don't want to get into all the details of that now. Um, and so he proposes to Jane, explains that he needs to be married to complete missionary work in the Holy Land, which is his dream. And he's like, "Oh, you can speak out for fellow unclaimed embryos by like yourself, because that's basically why Jane has been rejected." I forgot to say, because what we learn in the first book is that she was basically, you know, through IVF was created in a lab and no one ever claimed her. And so that's basically why she's treated as an outcast and doesn't even have a last name, just E. And Jane's like, "No, I want someone who actually loves me." And so she keeps saying no to Jordan, gets some sort of voicemail or something from Thorne. I forget exactly how it's supposed to be like miraculous and all that, but she goes back to Emheim Matcha, finds it burned. And another clever thing that Cup did is the way Jane finds out exactly what happened is she pulls up a bunch of news articles about the fire. And then she learns that after Thorne, who for some reason refused all painkillers and hasn't undergone any regenerative treatments since being injured in the fire, has been living at his mother's home in Ireland. So Jane flies there, is reunited with him, and in this version, he has no servants, unlike the original. He's living completely by himself, and you can probably guess how that's going on because the way Cup describes Thorne's appearance post-fire just, uh, it can cut you to the heart. He's blind, his fingers are burnt off, he can't really feel anything, his nerves have been damaged. And so he's obviously overjoyed to see Jane again. And one exchange I liked in this book was that Thorne says, "I really want to draw you to me and hug you tight." And Jane says, "Well, why aren't you doing so?" And he says, "Because I know now that I can't control you, and I respect you too much to bother trying." The next day, Thorne explains that when he discovered that Jane had left her perks ring behind, he got worried and basically prayed to God that any hardship that was bound to come Jane's way, let it come to him instead. And sure enough, it happened. And he explained that's why Jane read in the papers that he'd refused all painkillers and all that. And he said that tempting as it was for him to commit suicide, he was one, afraid Jane would think him a coward if she found out he'd done that. And two, he was afraid that if he were dead, Jane would get hurt because he wasn't around to suffer for her. And I think I teared up a little bit reading that, just understanding, wow, he's really come such a long way, really learned what love is, like a true part of loving someone. And so he and Jane marry happily ever after. And so great series overall. Love the way that Jane was plucked from Victorian England to sci-fi America, but again, a few issues I had with some of the details put in. And one fun thing about this is she broke it down so that the stories match on a chapter by chapter basis. So it was fun for me to go to chapter 19 and be like, oh, how are they going to do the gypsy scene in this one? All right, our next retelling is a little bit different. The Governess of Thornfield by Charlene de Kalb. If you're a big Jane Eyre fanatic like I am, you may recognize this lady as the woman who creates the Enthusiast Guide to Jane Eyre website and the Eyre Guide. So, this book, The Governess of Thornfield, is a choose your own adventure version of the original. I hadn't really done any choose your own adventures before this one, other than the Titanic with my sister. And I just had so much fun working through the story and thinking about questions like, are you going to choose Mr. Rochester or St. John? Will you go to Lowood or stay at Gateshead? And it was just really neat to think about to actually be this character and, think about what you would have done in her shoes. And I had to laugh several times reading it because the alternate endings can be both funny yet brutal. And I would encourage you to do it if you like Choose Your Own Adventures or the Bronte sisters. All right. Now we're shifting gears and looking at radio. These are two radio adaptations I've listened to. The first of which is BBC's Radio 4, starring Amanda Hale as Jane Eyre and Tom Burke as Mr. Rochester. This one had a nice flow to the story. Amanda Hale had a nice voice for the character, but she could have put more feeling into her delivery. And similarly, Tom Burke has a nice voice for the character of Rochester, but his portrayal struck me as very calm, other than one scene where he's banging on her door and screaming, Jane. Um, so this one had a nice flow, as I've said before, but some of the choices were kind of like they keep mentioning Adele, and we'll even talk to her, but we don't actually hear Adele herself speak in this audio drama. Two, the Christian elements were sidestepped in a weird way. An example that particularly stands out to me is Jane talking about how Rochester became an idol during their engagement period. In the original, she says, he stood between me and every thought of religion. But in this audio drama, she says, he is standing between me. Sorry, he's the only thing standing between me and the sun. And the music they used just got kind of repetitive. Like they seem to use the same music over and over again when transitioning between scenes. The second one is the LA Theater Works recording. So this one stars Emily Burgle as Jane Eyre and Nick Torrin as Rochester. I like Emily's Jane. She had more feeling in it. Sometimes she did kind of overdo it a little bit or said things a little unnaturally. I mean, this one is a little overdone in some cases. And Nick Torrin as Rochester, I mean, he reads all right, but yeah, nothing super memorable or that really stood out to me. This one does have a more rushed feel to it. And it had some really weird whispers. When, for example, when Jane is trying to tend to Mason, all these weird voices flash through her head like, put Jane Eyre in the red room, the red room, the red room. See the shadows darkening on the tapestry. And I'm thinking, what? Like, this doesn't really belong. But it did draw a lot out of the book in terms of dialogue. I think the BBC one did too. I mean, I haven't listened to it in a long time, but I'm just going to go ahead and spill the beans. I think, much to my surprise, considering LA Theatre Works' only reviews have been negative, I actually liked it better than BBC's because one, they actually did have an Adele. Two, they had a wider range of music. For example, they'd use harpsichord music when transitioning between certain scenes that happen within Thornfield, one right after the other. But then when Jane runs away, they play a dramatic violin suite. And two is the context in which these were recorded. I mean, I like studio recordings as well, BBC's was recorded in a studio, but LA Theater Works' was recorded before a live audience, which I always really enjoy hearing because it's fun to hear the audience applaud and laugh, especially during scenes that I've always thought should be laughed over, like the gypsy scene or when Jane just tells Rochester, "You're not handsome." And then the biggest thing you can probably guess is the Christian elements. Like LA Theater Works was explicit about them and wasn't just like, oh, we gotta mention God because Jane talks about him in the book, but they were like even biblical with some of the references. For example, when Jane's describing her restlessness despite having fled a potentially disastrous relationship with Rochester, she's like, St. John and I have not yet found the peace of God that passeth all understanding. That comes from one of St. Paul's letters. I forget which one though. And then two is when she's considering St. John's proposal, you can hear St. John reading the part of the Gospels in which Jesus says, I am the resurrection of the life. And my personal favorite is during the post-wedding, aka breakup scene. And Rochester's like, oh, you won't injure anybody if you stay with me. And Jane says, laws and principles are not for the times when there's no temptation. If at my individual's convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? And that is my favorite quote in the entire book. And none of the film adaptations I've seen have included it. So actually in hearing it in an adaptation, I was like, yes! So well done, LA Theater Works. BBC were very good too, but and finally, last but not least, I want to give a quick shout out to the Jane Eyre Broadway musical. Before I was a Jane Eyre nerd, I was a musical theater nerd. And even though I read this book a long time ago, I only just fallen in love with the musical over the past 2 weeks. It does retain a lot of Bronte's original dialogue. I like the classical edge it takes with the music. And what's really cool is that it's written so that you only need 10 cast members. So everyone except Jane and Rochester plays multiple parts. And I really like the way Jane and Rochester's duets are written. I think my favorite song is a toss-up between Sirens and Sirens Reprise. One nitpicky thing about it, though, is that Jane, instead of wandering upon Moor House, accidentally wanders back to Gateshead. What? But other than that, I love this show. And I was in the car last night and I just spent like 15 minutes singing Secret Soul Sirens and Sirens Reprise. For sirens call the sailors, he calls to me. And that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless. Bye.